In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. A book was published last year with the intriguing title, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate. A book full of out-of-the-way learning and unusual sophistication of argument, discussing that great dialogue between Pilate and Jesus, which forms so much of St. John's narrative of Jesus' last days on earth. But I wonder whether there would be another book to be written under the title, The Bafflement of Pontius Pilate. Pilate, in all four Gospels, appears as someone who doesn't really know what the problem is. The chief priests bring Jesus before his tribunal, and he wants to know why. What is the crime for which this insignificant Galilean workman has been brought to his court? It appears to be nothing more than one of those technical problems in Jewish law, which is none of his business. Take him and judge him yourselves. Rather like the reaction reported in Acts chapter 18, when Gallio, the proconsul in Corinth, is invited to pass judgment on Paul. Gallio, we're told, cared for none of these things. And Pilate would quite like to care for none of these things. It's not his problem. What Jesus says and does, and what the Jewish people are saying and doing, is not his business. They belong in another story, another world from his. Why should this matter to him or to anyone else? And the beginning of Pilate's bafflement, therefore, is this presentation before him of another frame of reference, another world. And that increasingly tense exchange of questions and answers between him and Jesus in the scenes of the trial is the process by which Pilate begins, very slowly and very uncertainly, to see why this might be his business and why this might be his world, his story. What if the Jews and their world are the pivot for the rest of the world's story? What if they really are the crucible of the world's future? Jesus is being handed over to Pontius Pilate by the ruling clique in the Jewish priesthood because Jesus has challenged Israel to be its true and full self. He has attacked a leadership which seeks to make Israel less than its true and real self. He has presented himself as the one who summons Israel again to its calling, who rebuilds its identity and its integrity. Like the other Hebrew prophets, he challenges its unfaithful leadership so that the people may respond once again to the call to liberty and the call to justice, which makes them who they are. And Israel has to be who it is, has to live out its identity and its integrity, so the Hebrew prophets believed, to be a sign of promise and of judgment among the nations of the world. God has called a community to be his own, to be the flock of his inheritance, to be his special people, so that the world may see what a human life is like when fully imprinted by the will of God for justice and generosity and love. We could say then that Jesus is handed over to Pilate as a sign of the universal significance of God's promise to Abraham and God's law given to Moses. Jesus stands for the integrity, the wholeness of a covenant whose significance is not just for the people of Israel, but for all God's children scattered abroad. words that St. John puts into the mouth of the high priest Caiaphas, the very high priest who is handing Jesus over to him in one of those wonderful touches of John's irony in the Gospel. Pilate, in his questioning, is gradually coming to see that the story of Israel, the world of covenant and faithfulness, the world of justice and mercy and love, is, in the most unwelcome way possible, the world he lives in, whether he likes it or not. The people of Israel are chosen and called by God to be there so that human beings will not have anywhere to hide from the presence and the radiance of God's justice. It is in the world, in the form of a shared human life, held up before the nations to call them to justice and to peace. It is indeed the business of the wider world. It is the story in which the wider world will eventually find its own place. Pontius Pilate's interrogations open this up step by step. He begins, of course, with that contemptuous, half-serious question: am I a Jew? You cannot expect me to take this seriously. You know I don't belong with you. We Romans tolerate you as an eccentric group too difficult to assimilate. We can just about manage that. But don't pretend that your calling has anything to do with what is laid upon the rest of us as a possibility, as a challenge, and as a promise. Pilate must discover how it matters. He must discover that the person before him, who stands for that promise and challenge and integrity, is a person whose significance cannot be wrapped up in the quarrels and technical disputes of a despised, barely tolerated minority. Because for the health of all human beings, it matters that there should be a community living under promise, living out of dependence on God's gift, and seeking to live in its daily relationships that justice, that compassion, which is God's own life. As we shall see later on in the week, as Pilate pursues his questioning, it becomes uncomfortably clear to him that there is a still greater problem looming up behind the figure who stands before him in his court. Not only is Pilate being challenged to see that the integrity of the Jewish people represented by this figure before him is of importance to him and to all human beings, the question begins to appear on the radar: who on earth is it who has the authority to represent within Israel the call of its God, the challenge of its divine covenant partner? And that's the point at which Pilate, very justifiably, begins to panic. God's kingdom, God's portion and inheritance, God's people, that calling which begins in the life of ancient Israel, which continues to this day as the calling of the Jewish people, that gift of God to create a people for his glory, a people reflecting his justice and his compassion in their day-to-day relationships, that is the root from which our Christian community grows. And it is crucial that we do not forget it. The church in the world occupies a very strange, diverse set of places. Respected in some ways, neglected and marginalized in others, despised, sometimes even feared. Why should our business be the business of the world around us? Why should our story have any claim to be the story of all of our fellow human beings? God knows that the first thing that comes into people's minds when they hear the word church is not necessarily a community radiant with the justice, love, and compassion of its eternal maker and lover. And yet, if the church were not there, if the reality and promise of a community living simply from the justice of God were absent from the world, what would the world lack? How would the world continue to live? That's the immense claim that the church makes. We, failing conspicuously, we struggling daily to live out this calling, just like the people of Israel in the first covenant days. We are those upon whom the ends of the ages have come. As St. Paul puts it, we are those whose fragrance ought to fill the whole house, as our gospel reminded us tonight. We are those people are invited to come to see because we have been raised from the dead, like Lazarus in the gospel tonight. And is this, we must ask ourselves, is this what we most deeply have to say and be in our world? Jesus did not live and die and rise in order to establish a new religion which needed constantly to bolster its confidence by gaining recruits and signing up new members and new subscriptions. Jesus lived and died and rose to manifest what Israel was called to be, a human community showing what a God-imprinted humanity looks like, what the human clay looks like when the thumbprint of God is pressed into it. That's what the church is to be. And in that, it is to be both judgment and promise for the world. And when we as church turn to the world, turn to Pilate in our own day, what we have to say is not join an in-group, but see what the human calling might be. Be called to account by this vision of human possibility. Be judged by this. Be transformed by this. This is your story. This is your world. Jesus, the King of the Jews, Jesus, who sums up the identity and integrity of Israel. Jesus is indeed the business of all humanity. Welcome or unwelcome, this is the message we seek to extend, the invitation that we open. And we shall do it, how well we know this, not by our successful performance, but by our willingness to be resurrected from our brokenness, so that the scent will fill the whole house, so that the word of promise and invitation will fill the whole world.